There is something your biology knows that your history books do not. Every cell in your body carries a story that goes back not 300,000 years to the first anatomically modern humans in Africa, but much further, back through a tangle of meetings and separations and encounters so complex that the word family does not quite capture it, and the word stranger does not quite capture it either. You're not the descendant of a single line. You're the product of a collision, of multiple collisions actually, played out across hundreds of thousands of years in the forests and valleys and mountain passes of a world that looked almost like this one, but was, in the most important way, completely different. That difference is this: you are not alone. For most of the time that beings shaped like us have walked this earth, there were others. Not animals, not creatures so distant from us that the word cousin would be a stretch. Others, beings who buried their dead and made jewellery and painted in the darkness of caves and looked up at the same stars and felt, in whatever form their feeling took, something that we might without too much hesitation recognise as the need to leave a mark. To say, in the oldest language there is, I was here. They're gone now. All of them gone except one. Except us. And the question of how that happened, why this one lineage survived while the others did not, whether survival is even the right word for what occurred, is one of the most important questions in all of science and one of the most personal. Because the answer, it turns out, is written inside you, in the precise arrangement of nucleotides in your genome, in the stretch of DNA on chromosome 3 that affects how you respond to respiratory infection, in the variant of a gene that shapes how you experience pain, in the altitude adaptations carried by Tibetans who live and work at 4,000 meters without difficulty. The others are gone, and the others are inside us, and learning to hold both of those things at once is what tonight is about. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of how we came to understand that we were never alone begins not with a dramatic discovery in some remote wilderness, but with a piece of bone the size of a child's fingernail, found in a layer of sediment in a cave in the mountains of southern Siberia in the summer of 2008. The cave is called Denisova. It sits in the Altai Mountains at an altitude of roughly 700 meters at the confluence of two rivers, in a landscape that shifts between forest and steppe depending on the season and the century. It has been excavated for decades and has yielded the kinds of things that caves used by ancient humans typically yield: stone tools, animal bones, the ash remnants of ancient fires, the slow accumulation of evidence that beings like us were here. The bone fragment found in 2008 was catalogued as Denisova 3. It was identified as the terminal phalanx, the outermost bone, of a little finger, belonging to a juvenile, probably between 5 and 7 years old based on its size. In previous decades it would have been logged, stored, and largely forgotten. Too small for meaningful anatomical analysis. Too fragmentary to say anything definitive about the species of the individual who had carried it in life. But this was 2008, and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig had spent years developing techniques for extracting ancient DNA from exactly this kind of fragmentary material. The bone was sent to Leipzig, to a laboratory led by a Swedish geneticist named Svante Pääbo, who had devoted his career to what had once seemed an impossible task, reading the genetic code of beings who'd been dead for tens of thousands of years. What Pääbo's team found when they sequenced the mitochondrial DNA from that fragment of fingertip bone stopped the field of paleoanthropology in its tracks. The sequence did not match Homo sapiens. That had been anticipated. The cave showed evidence of Neanderthal occupation, and the team expected either modern human or Neanderthal DNA. It did not match Neanderthal either. It was something else entirely. A third lineage, a population of human beings that had been completely unknown to science, invisible to a century and a half of paleoanthropological research, because the bones they left behind were insufficient to reveal them, and because the technology needed to read their DNA had not existed until that moment. They were named the Denisovans, after the cave where the fingerbone was found, and the strangeness of their discovery, the way they appeared not as a skeleton or a skull, but as pure chemistry, pure information encoded in the double helix of ancient DNA, set the template for a revolution in how we understand the human past. At the time of the announcement in 2010, the entire physical evidence for this new species of human being consisted of one fingerbone and one tooth. One fingerbone, one tooth, and an entire species. This was not how paleoanthropology was supposed to work. For 150 years, the field had been built on bones, on the painstaking comparison of skull shapes and jaw angles and brow ridge projections. The Denisovans had no shape. They were a genetic signature, a ghost with a genome. Svante Pääbo received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for this work. The Nobel Committee used language almost never applied to a scientific discovery. They said his findings provided the foundation for understanding what makes us uniquely human. Not the foundation for understanding a new species, the foundation for understanding ourselves. Our companions tonight have been living with the implications of that discovery in different ways. Dr. Yuki is a paleoanthropologist and ancient DNA specialist at a university in Japan whose career has been shaped by the Denisovan revelation. She was a graduate student when the 2010 announcement was made, and she remembers the day with a precision that people reserve for moments that reorganize everything they thought they knew. She has spent the 15 years since working on the question that the Denisovans forced into the center of her field. How many of them were there? Where did they go? And what did they leave behind? Marcus is a geneticist in the United Kingdom whose own genome has been sequenced as part of a research project. And who knows, in the way that most people alive today do not, precisely how much of his DNA traces not to modern humans, but to beings who are not quite us. He carries approximately 2% Neanderthal DNA, slightly above the European average, and a smaller but measurable Denisovan signal. He thinks about what that means with a regularity that his colleagues sometimes find slightly unsettling. And Dr. Amara, who appeared in our sleep history journey, returns tonight not in her capacity as a sleep scientist, but as a South African researcher who has spent years working near what may be one of the most significant hominin sites in the world, the Rising Star Cave System, where a species called Homo naledi rewrote the oldest assumptions in human evolutionary biology. She has a particular interest in the beings that did not survive, in what their disappearance cost, in what it means for us that we are the last ones standing. Before we can understand the full roster of human species that shared this world with our ancestors, we need to understand what we got wrong about the ones we already knew. And nowhere is the distance between what we thought we knew and what the evidence actually shows greater than it is for the Neanderthals. For most of the 20th century, the Neanderthal occupied a very specific and very comfortable role in the popular imagination. They were the cautionary tale, the also ran, the evolutionary dead end that proved by contrast how superior Homo sapiens was. Museum dioramas depicted them as shambling, hunched, vacant-eyed creatures clutching crude spears. The word Neanderthal entered everyday language as a synonym for brutish and unthinking. That image is not merely incomplete, it is in almost every particular wrong. Consider what the evidence actually tells us about Neanderthal behaviour. In the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iraqi Kurdistan, a cave called Shanidar has yielded the remains of at least 10 Neanderthal individuals, buried across a period stretching from roughly 65,000 to 35,000 years ago. One of these individuals, known to researchers as Shanidar 1, had a story written in his bones that no diorama has ever fully captured. He had survived a crushing blow to the left side of his skull, severe enough to have left him blind in his left eye. His right arm had atrophied to the point of uselessness, either from birth injury or from severe damage sustained early in life. He had a healed fracture of his right leg. He lived to be between 40 and 50 years old. In a world where survival depended on physical capability, on the ability to hunt and forage and travel, this man survived for decades with one functional eye, one functional arm, and a damaged leg. He could only have survived if others sustained him, fed him, sheltered him, made deliberate decisions to keep alive a member of the group who contributed little to the group's physical survival. Whatever word you want to use for that practice, the word primitive is not it. The Neanderthal buried their dead, not consistently at every site and not always with elaborate ceremony, but the deliberate placement of bodies in the earth is well documented at multiple sites. La Chapelle aux Saints in France, Kibara Cave in Israel, Amud Cave in Israel. The practice of burial, of treating the dead as requiring something more than abandonment, implies at minimum an awareness of death as a distinct and significant state. It implies, quite possibly, something that functions like grief. They used pigment. Ochre, the red iron oxide that appears at human occupation sites across the world from very early in our evolutionary history, was present in Neanderthal contexts in ways that suggest deliberate application to bodies and objects. At Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, perforated marine shells that appear to have been used as personal ornaments, coloured with pigment, have been dated to 115,000 years ago. Modern humans had not yet arrived in Europe. These were Neanderthal ornaments. And then there is the cave art. In 2018, a team led by Alistair Pike of the University of Southampton published uranium-thorium dating results for cave art in 3 Spanish caves, La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales. The dates for some of the art were stunning. 65,000 years old, more than 20,000 years before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. Hand stencils, geometric shapes, lines made by pressing pigment to the cave wall in the darkness underground. The beings who made them were Neanderthals. They were making art in the dark, creating images that no one on the surface world would ever see. The act of making art in darkness, of carrying light into a cave and pressing a pigment-covered hand to stone, is not a survival behaviour. It does not put food on the fire or keep the cold away. It is something else, something that requires intentionality and a symbolic relationship to the visual world and a desire to leave a mark that outlasts the maker. Whatever we want to call that impulse, calling it primitive requires us to use the word in a way that no longer means anything. The Neanderthal brain was, on average, slightly larger than our own, approximately 1,400 cubic centimetres, compared to our average of 1,350. The distribution of brain volume was different. Larger occipital lobes associated with visual processing, somewhat smaller frontal and parietal lobes associated with certain kinds of abstract reasoning. But the idea that the Neanderthal mind was fundamentally less capable than ours, that their extinction was the inevitable outcome of a cognitive competition they were always going to lose, is not what the evidence supports. Dr. Yuki thinks about the Neanderthals with a care that goes beyond her professional obligations. She has spent enough time with the data to understand that they were not simply a lesser version of us. They were a different version of us, shaped by different pressures, adapted to different conditions, carrying in their biology and behaviour a set of solutions to the problems of existence that were not inferior to our solutions. They were simply ours, and then they were gone. 40,000 years ago, after 300,000 years of successful habitation across Europe and Western Asia, the Neanderthals disappeared from the fossil record within a few thousand years of the arrival of Homo sapiens. 3 explanations dominate the current scientific discussion, and none of them is entirely satisfying on its own. The first is direct competition. Homo sapiens expanding into Europe may have outcompeted Neanderthals for resources, not necessarily through systematic violence, though violence certainly occurred, but through the cumulative advantage of slightly more efficient foraging, slightly larger social networks, slightly better information sharing across group boundaries. A small competitive advantage maintained consistently over thousands of years is sufficient to collapse a population even in the absence of direct conflict. The mathematics are simple, and the outcome is not. The second explanation is disease. When Homo sapiens moved out of Africa and through the Middle East, they carried with them pathogens from environments the Neanderthals had never been exposed to. A disease to which one population has developed immunity and another has not can eliminate a significant fraction of the unprotected population within a single generation. The analogy to what happened to indigenous populations of the Americas after European contact in the 16th century is sobering, and the scale of what could have happened to Neanderthals may have been comparable. The third explanation is the one that changes the meaning of the word disappeared, because the genetic evidence, now unambiguous, shows that when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals met in Europe and the Middle East, they interbred, substantially, repeatedly, over a period of thousands of years. Every person alive today who is not of purely sub-Saharan African ancestry carries between 1.8 and 2.6% Neanderthal DNA in their genome. That DNA has been there for between 50,000 and 60,000 years. It was incorporated when the ancestors of non-African modern humans encountered Neanderthal populations as they moved out of Africa and into new territory. 2% sounds small, distributed across roughly 6 billion people of non-African ancestry. The total amount of Neanderthal DNA preserved in living human genomes exceeds what existed in the entire Neanderthal population at its peak. They did not disappear. They were absorbed, distributed, and some of what they gave us we still use. Neanderthal genetic variants have been identified that appear to have been positively selected in Homo sapiens populations after the hybridization events. Variants associated with immune function, with skin and hair characteristics useful in the colder climates of Europe and Asia, with responses to specific pathogens. We kept what worked. We also kept some of what did not work as well in modern conditions. Neanderthal variants have been associated with increased risk of depression, with blood clotting disorders, and in a finding that acquired sudden relevance in 2020, a stretch of Neanderthal DNA on chromosome 3 appears to roughly double the risk of requiring respiratory support in severe COVID-19 infection. The Neanderthals have been gone for 40,000 years, and they are still affecting how some of us experience illness. Their biology persists in ours in ways that we are only beginning to understand. Marcus carries 2% of that inheritance. When he thinks about it, and he thinks about it more than is probably conventional for a geneticist, what strikes him most is not the strangeness of it, but the ordinariness. The Neanderthal DNA in his genome is not alien. It does not feel foreign from the inside. It has been part of the human genome for 50,000 years. It is as much a part of what makes him human as any other stretch of DNA in any of his cells. The boundary between his genome and theirs is not where he thought it was before he knew about it. It is not drawn at any point in the past that can be identified with precision. It runs through him, in the present tense. We've established that the Denisovans existed. What we have not yet established is how extraordinary the implications of their existence actually are. When Perbo's team completed their analysis of the Denisovan genome, from the fingerbone, then from additional teeth found in the same cave, then from a partial skull found years later, they discovered something that the physical evidence alone could never have revealed. The Denisovans were not a regional population. They were not simply a Siberian variant of Homo sapiens or Neanderthals. They were a distinct lineage that had separated from the Neanderthal branch of the human family tree approximately 400,000 years ago, long before the emergence of modern humans, and had subsequently spread across an enormous geographic range. How do we know their range without finding their bones across that range? Because they left their DNA in the people who live there today. The Denisovan genetic signal is found at its highest concentration in Melanesian populations, the indigenous peoples of Papua New Guinea and the surrounding islands, where it accounts for approximately 4 to 6% of the genome. It is found at lower but meaningful levels in Aboriginal Australians, in Polynesian populations, in some Southeast Asian populations, and in the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This distribution tells a story that the Denisova cave alone could never have told. These people were not confined to a single cave in Siberia. They were spread across much of Asia, from the cold steppes of the north to the tropical islands of the far south. When the ancestors of modern humans arrived from Africa and began moving eastward through Asia, they encountered Denisovans repeatedly. They interbred repeatedly. The genetic signal has been recovered from so many different populations across such a wide geographic range that researchers now believe there were multiple distinct Denisovan populations, possibly as genetically different from each other as modern Europeans are from modern Africans. In 2019, a fragment of jawbone was identified in a museum collection in China. It had been found by a Buddhist monk on a riverbed in Jiahe, in Tibet, in 1980, and had been held in a university repository for decades without anyone understanding what it was. When researchers applied protein analysis, a technique capable of recovering biological information from bones too old to yield usable DNA, the jaw turned out to be Denisovan. It had been found at an altitude of 3,400 meters on the Tibetan plateau. It was at least 160,000 years old. The Denisovans were living at high altitude on the Tibetan plateau 160,000 years ago, and the genetic variant that allows modern Tibetans to live and work and reproduce at extreme altitude, a variant of the gene EPAS1 that prevents the dangerous overproduction of red blood cells in low oxygen conditions, is a Denisovan variant. Tibetan people inherited their high-altitude adaptation from the Denisovans, who lived in those mountains long before their ancestors arrived. The people who first mastered the roof of the world passed their biological toolkit to their successors. That is not replacement. That is inheritance across species boundaries. Dr. Yuki finds the EPAS1 finding the most beautiful piece of data in her field, not because it is dramatic, though it is, but because of what it implies about the nature of the relationship between Homo sapiens and the Denisovans. A modern Tibetan farmer walking his fields at 4,000 meters, his body managing the thin air effortlessly, is carrying in his genome a solution to a problem that a Denisovan individual solved through evolution hundreds of thousands of years ago. The solution passed from Denisovan to modern human at some point when the two populations met and interbred, and it has been working silently and effectively in the bodies of the people who inherited it ever since. The Denisovans did not simply disappear. Their genome lives on in the bodies of millions of people across Asia and the Pacific. Their high-altitude adaptation is the reason Tibetans can live where Tibetans live. Their immune system variants are present in Melanesian populations who have been resistant to certain diseases that devastate others. They are gone as a population, as a culture, as a way of being alive in the world. But in the most precise biological sense, they are not entirely gone. They are distributed, carried forward in the bodies of the people whose ancestors met them, recognized something worth joining with, and incorporated them. The Denisovans and the Neanderthals are the best known of our extinct relatives, but they were not the only ones, and some of the others were stranger in ways that force a fundamental reconsideration of what we thought we knew about the relationship between brain size and the capacity for complex behavior. In 2003, researchers excavating Liang Bua Cave on the Indonesian island of Flores found the skeleton of an adult female hominin that stood approximately 1 meter tall and had a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, about 400 cubic centimeters. She was given the species name Homo floresiensis. Informally, almost immediately, she was called the Hobbit. She was not alone. The remains of at least 9 individuals of the same species were eventually recovered from the cave. They had been living on Flores for at least 100,000 years before modern humans arrived in the region, and possibly for as long as 700,000 years. Their stone tools were present throughout the layers of the cave, and the animal bones found alongside those tools included the bones of Stegodon, a dwarf elephant that also inhabited the island, bearing evidence of processing consistent with cooperative hunting and butchery. A species with a brain the size of a chimpanzee's was hunting elephants with stone tools, and what the evidence suggests was coordinated group strategy. This shattered one of the most fundamental assumptions in paleoanthropology, the assumption that brain size and cognitive capability are directly and simply related. Homo floresiensis achieved behavioral complexity that its brain size, by all existing models, should have made impossible. The most likely explanation is that the Flores hominins were descended from Homo erectus populations that had reached the island at some point in the distant past and had subsequently undergone island dwarfism, the well-documented evolutionary phenomenon by which large-bodied animals isolated on islands evolved towards smaller body size over generations in response to resource constraints. The brain shrank. But the cognitive architecture necessary for complex behavior was apparently preserved in that reduced form, in configurations that our crude metric of brain volume had completely failed to predict. Homo floresiensis survived on Flores until approximately 50,000 years ago. Then they disappeared, around the time modern humans were first moving through the region. In 2019, a different team announced the identification of yet another new hominin species, this one from the Philippine island of Luzon. Based on fossils recovered from Calao Cave, the species was named Homo luzonensis. It was small, with unusual anatomical features that combined characteristics found in much older species with features more typical of later hominins. It had been present on Luzon until at least 50 to 67,000 years ago, and like the Hobbits of Flores, it disappeared from the record around the time modern humans were arriving in the region. The pattern is uncomfortable. Species after species, island after island, the disappearances coincide with the expansion of Homo sapiens. The correlation is not proof of causation, but it is striking enough that avoiding its implications requires a deliberate act of interpretive will. Dr. Amara thinks about the island species with particular attention to what they represent for our understanding of human cognitive diversity. The assumption embedded in most accounts of human evolution is that cognitive complexity scaled with brain size, and that modern humans at the top of the brain size distribution were therefore at the top of the cognitive distribution as well. The Hobbits complicate that assumption. A species with a brain smaller than a chimpanzee's, hunting cooperative prey with manufactured tools in coordinated groups, achieved a form of behavioral complexity that our models said it should not have been able to achieve. Whatever was in that small brain was not what we expected. She finds this humbling, not in a diminishing way, but in the way that any genuine confrontation with the limits of what we thought we knew should be humbling. The categories we use to understand minds are not adequate to the diversity of minds that have existed. They may not be adequate to the diversity of minds that exist now, within our own species. The Hobbits suggest that intelligence, whatever that word means, found forms we have not yet learned to recognize. Before we can understand why only one of the 9 species survived, we need to understand the one that survived longest without being us. The one that outlasted all the others that adapted to more environments across a greater span of time than any other member of the human genus, that was in some sense the most successful hominin that ever lived, Homo erectus. The species appeared in Africa roughly 2 million years ago. It was the first hominin to leave Africa, at least the first whose departure is clearly documented in the fossil record. By 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus populations had reached the Caucasus region of what is now Georgia. By 1.6 million years ago, they were in Southeast Asia, where the Dutch physician Eugène Dubois excavated the first recognized specimen in Java in 1891 and 1892 and named it Pithecanthropus erectus, the upright ape man. The last known populations of Homo erectus on Java appear to have survived until approximately 117,000 years ago. That means Homo erectus, as a species, persisted for somewhere close to 2 million years. For context, our own species has existed for at most 300,000 years. Homo erectus lasted nearly 7 times longer than we have managed so far. They made fire. Not merely used fire when they found it, but made it. Evidence of controlled fire use by Homo erectus extends back at least 1 million years to Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. They made hand axes, a standardized tool technology so consistent in its design across such an enormous geographic range that the same basic tool form was produced in Africa, Europe, and Asia for over 1 million years. Making that tool required the ability to visualize the final shape within the raw material before a single flake had been struck. It required planning in a meaningful sense. And yet Homo erectus, for all its longevity and its geographic success, never, as far as we can determine, made art. Never buried its dead with any consistency. Never created personal ornaments. Its tool technology, sophisticated as it was, did not change substantially for over 1 million years. Whatever cognitive revolution produced the capacity for symbolic thought, for language complex enough to transmit culture across generations, for the accumulated knowledge that builds on itself from one lifetime to the next, it had not occurred in Homo erectus. The comparison between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens is one of the most important in evolutionary biology, and its implications are still being worked through. A species can be extraordinarily successful by any measurable standard, geographic range, longevity, ecological flexibility, and still lack whatever specific cognitive capacity produces symbolic culture. Brain size is not sufficient. Longevity is not sufficient. Geographic range is not sufficient. Something else is required. Something specific enough that it appears to have arisen only once in the entire history of the genus Homo. And whatever that something was, it changed everything. In 2013, cavers exploring a system called Rising Star in South Africa's Cradle of Humankind region discovered a passage so narrow that the researchers who would eventually excavate it had to be selected partly on the basis of their ability to fit through a squeeze of approximately 18 centimeters. The passage opened into a chamber called the Dinaledi Chamber. Inside the chamber, they found bones, extraordinary numbers of bones, the remains of at least 15 individuals representing a previously unknown species of hominin. Homo naledi was strange in ways that no category of existing knowledge prepared the researchers to understand. Its brain was tiny, approximately 400 to 600 cubic centimeters, smaller than a chimpanzee's, far smaller than any other member of the genus Homo. Its body was small, roughly 1.5 meters tall. Its feet were almost identical to ours, adapted for bipedal walking on the ground in ways that suggested a lifestyle similar to our own. Its hands were adapted for climbing in ways that no other species of Homo shows. Its skull, in its primitive characteristics, suggested enormous age, perhaps 2 to 3 million years. The anatomical features of Homo naledi, taken together, suggested a species from the earliest chapters of the human story. The dating results, published in 2017, produced one of the most startling findings in the history of paleoanthropology. Homo naledi was between 235,000 and 335,000 years old, not 2 million years old, not ancient in the sense that its anatomy suggested. This tiny-brained, primitive-featured creature was alive during the same period as Neanderthals, as Denisovans, as the earliest anatomically modern Homo sapiens. A species that in its physical characteristics looked as if it belonged to the dawn of the human genus, was sharing the African continent with our own direct ancestors. A creature from what appeared to be evolutionary deep time was, in geological terms, essentially our contemporary. And the Dinaledi chamber itself is the deepest puzzle. It sits at the end of a passage system that requires experience and specialized equipment to navigate safely. There is no evidence of carnivore activity in the chamber. No tooth marks on the hominin bones. No bones of prey animals mixed with the hominin remains. There is no evidence of habitation. No stone tools, no hearths, no evidence that the chamber was used for any purpose other than the one it apparently served. The most parsimonious explanation for why the remains of 15 individuals of the same species are concentrated in a single, almost inaccessible underground chamber, with no other explanation for their presence there, is that they were placed there deliberately. That Homo naledi, with its 400 cubic centimetre brain, was disposing of its dead in a specific, designated, consistently used location. If that is correct, then mortuary behaviour, the deliberate and repeated placement of the dead in a specific place, was not an achievement of large-brained, cognitively sophisticated hominins. It was something that a species with a brain smaller than many of our primate relatives was doing, possibly before modern humans were even present on the African continent. The researchers who led the Rising Star excavations have gone further. In papers published in 2023, they reported the discovery of what appear to be engravings on the walls of the Dinaledi chamber, geometric shapes, hash marks, crossed lines, made by Homo naledi. If confirmed, these would constitute the oldest known cave art in the world. Made not by Homo sapiens, not by Neanderthals, but by a species with a brain smaller than a gorilla's. The implications have not yet been fully absorbed by the scientific community. The debate over the engravings is ongoing, and the interpretation is contested. But even as a possibility, even as an as-yet unconfirmed hypothesis, the Homo naledi evidence forces a confrontation with assumptions that the field has held for a very long time. The assumption that symbolic behaviour requires a large brain. The assumption that mortuary practice requires cognitive sophistication of a kind only large-brained hominins could achieve. The assumption, underlying all the others, that the size of a brain is a reliable guide to the complexity of the mind it produces. Dr. Amara has been to the Rising Star cave system. She has been through the squeeze, has navigated the passage in the dark, has stood in the Dinaledi chamber and looked at the bones and the walls. She does not make claims beyond what the evidence supports. The engravings may be Homo naledis, or they may not be. The mortuary interpretation may be correct, or a yet unidentified mechanism may eventually explain the concentration of remains in a way that does not require deliberate deposition. What she cannot do, having stood in that chamber, is dismiss the possibility with the ease that would have been possible before she was there. The bones are real. The chamber is real. The question of how they came to be there together in that specific inaccessible place is a real question. And the most honest answer to a real question is sometimes, we do not know yet. There is one more story in this account, and it is in some ways the most haunting of all. In 1989, archaeologists working in a cave near the city of Mengzi in the Yunnan province of southern China found bones, hundreds of bones, mixed with charcoal and with the remains of the giant red deer that the cave's inhabitants had hunted and eaten, which is how the site Maludong acquired its informal name, Red Deer Cave. The bones had been partially burned. They had been cracked to extract the marrow. Whoever had lived in Red Deer Cave had used fire and had processed their food in ways entirely consistent with behaviourally modern humans. But the bones themselves were deeply strange. When researchers completed their formal analysis in 2012, the picture that emerged refused to fit any existing category. The skulls were thick-walled and heavily built, with prominent brow ridges and a steeply angled forehead. The brain case was smaller than modern humans, and had a shape outside the range of variation seen in any modern human population. The chin was absent, a feature strongly associated in the fossil record with archaic rather than modern humans. In every measurable physical characteristic, the Red Deer Cave people looked archaic, ancient, like a creature that belonged in the evolutionary deep past. But they had been alive in Yunnan province, in southern China, between 11,500 and 14,500 years ago. 14,000 years ago, the pyramids of Egypt were still 4,000 years in the future. Agriculture had just been invented in the Fertile Crescent. By any conventional definition, human civilization was already beginning in parts of the world. And in a cave in southern China, a population of beings whose skulls looked as if they belonged to a creature 500,000 years older was hunting red deer and cracking open marrow bones by firelight. The researchers who published the analysis were careful, appropriately careful, in their interpretation. They acknowledged that the Red Deer Cave people might represent a very early and divergent population of Homo sapiens that had retained archaic features through genetic isolation over a very long period. That is one possibility. But they also acknowledged the alternative, that these were the last survivors of an archaic human lineage, a population that had persisted in the refugia of southern China long after every other archaic hominin elsewhere had disappeared. If the alternative is correct, and it remains contested as it should, then the last non-sapiens human beings on Earth were not the Neanderthals of Europe, gone 40,000 years ago. They were not the Hobbits of Flores, gone 50,000 years ago. They were a group of hunters in a cave in China who were alive within the period of human oral tradition, within the span of time when the first cities were being built and the first writing systems were being developed on the other side of the Eurasian continent. We do not know what happened to them. The fossil record simply stops. Whether they were absorbed into the expanding modern human population of southern China through interbreeding, whether they succumbed to disease, whether they were displaced by competition until no viable population remained, we cannot say. What we can say is this: if the Red Deer Cave people were indeed a distinct archaic lineage, then for a significant portion of what we call history, there was another kind of human being alive on this planet. They were there when the first farmers were planting the first crops. They were there when the first boats were being navigated across open ocean. They were there, possibly, while the first stories were being told around fires on the other side of the world, and nobody knew, or if anyone knew, if any modern human being in southern China 14,000 years ago encountered the Red Deer Cave people, looked at them across whatever distance separated the fire from the darkness beyond it, they did not record the encounter in any form that has survived. Dr. Yuki thinks about this encounter that may or may not have happened with more regularity than is probably professionally useful. She thinks about what it would have meant to look across that distance and see something that was almost like you, almost like a mirror, but not quite. A face that was recognizably a face but assembled by a slightly different set of evolutionary pressures over a slightly different span of time. Would you have recognized the kinship? Would you have been afraid? Would you have extended a hand or raised a weapon? What word in whatever language you had would you have used for what you were looking at? We will never know. The encounter, if it happened, left no record we can read, but the question itself matters, because it is the question that the entire history we've been telling tonight is ultimately asking. We built an entire civilization on the assumption that we are the only kind of human being. Our religions, our philosophies, our legal systems, our moral frameworks, all of them assume a single human nature, a single category of being that is either fully human or not human at all. The world of the Red Deer Cave people, if they were truly distinct, did not have that luxury. In their world, the boundary between human and other human was not philosophical. It was something you might encounter on the other side of a mountain range in a valley you had never entered. Of all the questions that this story raises, the one that presses most insistently is the simplest. Why did only one of the 9 survive? What did Homo sapiens have that the others did not? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, and the dishonest answer, the one that dressed itself in the language of evolutionary necessity for most of the 20th century, was that we were simply better, smarter, more adaptable. The winners of a competition that was always going to end the way it ended. That answer has not survived contact with the evidence. The Neanderthals made art and buried their dead and cared for their injured. The Hobbits hunted elephants with coordinated strategy. Homo naledi may have been interring its dead in a designated location before modern humans were present in southern Africa. The Red Deer Cave people maintained a viable population for tens or hundreds of thousands of years in the refugia of southern China. None of these species were simply outcompeted by obviously superior opponents. Whatever advantage Homo sapiens had over the others was real, but it was not the overwhelming superiority that the old narrative required. The most compelling hypothesis, the one that best fits the evidence currently available, centers not on raw intelligence, but on the specific capacity for cumulative culture. What Homo sapiens had was the ability to transmit knowledge across generations in ways that allowed that knowledge to accumulate and build on itself. A Neanderthal could learn from direct observation and from the members of the small group it lived with. A Homo sapiens could learn from people it had never met, from knowledge encoded in language and story, and symbolic systems that could be transmitted across time and space, from teachers who had learned from other teachers who had learned from others before them. Each generation could inherit not just the genetic adaptations of its predecessors, but the accumulated cognitive achievements, the tools, the techniques, the maps, the stories, the understanding of the world that its predecessors had assembled. This is cumulative culture, the ratchet that moves in only one direction, where each generation starts from a position further along than the last. It is what makes human technology so different from any other species' technology. It is why the stone tools of Homo erectus barely change for 1 million years. Without the cultural transmission mechanisms to accumulate improvements across generations, there was no ratchet. Whatever one individual discovered died with that individual unless it was transmitted directly, through observation, to the group immediately around them. Homo sapiens had the ratchet, or at least had it in a form more powerful than any of the others, and over thousands of years the advantage of having the ratchet compounded into outcomes that look, from our current position at the far end of the process, absolute. The others are gone. We are here. The competition is over. Except that the competition was never quite what we thought it was. Because the genetic evidence accumulated over the last 15 years tells a story not of replacement but of absorption, of a spreading modern human population that incorporated genetic material from every archaic population it encountered, that consumed, in a biological sense, the others, absorbing their genes into the expanding modern human gene pool even as their separate populations dissolved. 74,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano in what is now Indonesia erupted, the largest volcanic eruption in approximately the last 2 million years. The ash cloud covered South Asia. the sulfur dioxide injection into the stratosphere triggered a volcanic winter that reduced global temperatures by somewhere between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius for years. The genetic evidence from modern human populations suggests that in the aftermath of Toba, the global population of Homo sapiens collapsed to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. Some estimates go lower. The entire species reduced to a group that would fit in a small town. This is called the Toba bottleneck, and its effects are still visible in modern human genomes today. Compared to almost every other primate species, Homo sapiens shows remarkably low genetic diversity. The genetic difference between any two randomly selected humans from opposite ends of the Earth is smaller than the genetic difference between two gorillas living in the same forest. We're all, genetically speaking, extremely similar. The legacy of that near-extinction event 74,000 years ago, when the population from which all living humans descend was reduced to a fragment of what it had been. Whether the Toba eruption drove any of the other human species to extinction is debated. What is clear is that the disappearances happened across a wide span of time and geography, and that in case after case the timing coincides with the expansion of modern humans into new regions. The correlation does not tell us everything, but it tells us something. We are the last ones. That is the fact. Of the 9 species, or however many there were, because the number 9 is a snapshot of current knowledge and the fossil record is incomplete, and there may have been others whose bones have not yet been found or have not yet been recognized for what they are. Only one remains. Only us. And yet, the story does not end with our survival. It continues in every cell of every human body alive today that carries the genetic legacy of those encounters. The meetings in the Middle East where our ancestors mated with Neanderthals. The encounters across the forests and coasts of Asia where Denisovans contributed their adaptations to the people moving through their range. The possible interbreeding with archaic populations in Africa, whose genetic signature has been detected in the genomes of living West Africans. A ghost population, as researchers call it, whose genome has not yet been directly recovered from any fossil, but whose presence in the gene pool is statistically unambiguous. There were archaic humans in Africa too, contributing to the modern human gene pool in ways that we're only beginning to trace. The absorption was not limited to the migrations out of Africa. It happened in Africa as well, before and during the emergence of modern humans, as our ancestors encountered and incorporated genetic material from populations that were different enough to be distinguishable, but close enough to interbreed. We are not the descendants of a single line. We are a synthesis. The product of collisions, of meetings, of encounters across the full spectrum from violence to intimacy, played out across hundreds of thousands of years and across every landscape that hominins had colonized. Marcus thinks about this in quiet moments. The 2% of Neanderthal DNA in his genome does not feel like a foreign body. It does not feel like contamination or intrusion. It feels, insofar as he can feel anything about the molecular architecture of his cells, like part of him. Because it is part of him. It has been part of the human genome for 50,000 years. Whatever the Neanderthal was who first contributed that stretch of DNA to the modern human gene pool, their contribution has been selected, maintained, replicated, passed from parent to child across 2,000 generations. It is as thoroughly human as anything else in any human genome. In 2021, researchers published a study examining a variant of the gene CN9A, a gene that regulates the flow of sodium ions in neurons and plays a role in pain perception in modern human populations. They found that a variant associated with heightened pain sensitivity is present in approximately 15% of people of Eurasian ancestry. The variant is Neanderthal in origin. It entered the Homo sapiens gene pool through the interbreeding events of 50 to 60,000 years ago. 15% of Eurasians feel pain differently because of the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals are gone as a population. Their cultures are lost. Their languages, if they had language, and the anatomy of the Kibara cave hyoid bone suggests they probably did, are silent. And yet in a hospital room somewhere, in a moment of physical suffering, something of them is still present, still feeling. The boundary between their world and ours is not where we thought it was. It does not lie at any point in the past we can precisely identify. It runs through us, right now, in the present tense, in the way some of us experience pain, in the way Tibetans breathe at altitude, in the immune systems of Melanesian populations, in stretches of DNA in West African genomes that trace to a population we have not yet even found a name for. They are gone, and they are inside us. And learning to hold both of those things at once, to understand that extinction and survival are not as cleanly separated as we thought, that the diversity we carry is partly the legacy of a diversity that once walked the earth in separate bodies, is perhaps the most important thing that the ancient DNA revolution has given us. Dr. Yuki is at her desk in Kyoto late in the evening, surrounded by the kind of organised chaos that accumulates around someone who has spent 15 years thinking very hard about the same set of questions. On her screen is a visualization of the Denisovan genome, the mountain of data extracted from a fingerbone that shouldn't, by any reasonable expectation, have survived 60,000 years of geological time in usable form. She looks at it most evenings, not because she needs to look at it, but because it still, after 15 years, strikes her as something close to miraculous. That there was once a child in a cave in Siberia, that the child left behind a fragment of bone smaller than a coin, that the bone happened to be preserved in conditions cold and dry enough to keep the DNA intact across 60,000 years, that the technology to read that DNA was developed in precisely the laboratory that received precisely that bone at precisely the right moment in the history of the science, that out of all those contingencies, a species came back from invisibility. She cannot help thinking about what else is still invisible. How many other populations left no bone in good enough condition to survive? How many lineages dissolved into the human gene pool without leaving a trace that the current technology can detect? How much of the diversity of the Pleistocene world died not with the last individual of a species, but with the last fragment of DNA from that species crossing the threshold below which current technology cannot go? She holds those absences carefully. They're as much a part of the story as the discoveries. Marcus is at home, which is a flat in a city in the north of England. He's not thinking about paleoanthropology tonight. He's thinking about something else entirely, something ordinary and immediate, the ordinary and immediate things that fill a life. And somewhere in the cells of the body he's living in, 2% of a genome that belonged to beings who died 40,000 years ago is doing whatever it does, expressing proteins, regulating processes, contributing in ways that cannot be individually traced to the experience of being alive in a body that is partly ancient in ways that Marcus himself will never fully understand. The Neanderthal legacy is not dramatic from the inside. It does not announce itself. It is woven into the fabric of what he is, in the same way that every other stretch of his genome is woven into that fabric, indistinguishable from the inside from the rest of him. Dr. Amara is in South Africa, which is where she almost always is. She's not at a cave site tonight. She's at home, and she's thinking about a hand. Specifically about the hand stencil in the cave of Ardoles in Spain, 65,000 years old, pressed into the stone by a Neanderthal who carried a light into the darkness underground and chose a surface and held their hand against it and blew pigment from their mouth or from a tube until the outline was clear. The hand is still there. The pigment is still red against the limestone. She thinks about what it means to leave a mark. The Neanderthal who made that mark was not doing it to communicate with 65,000 years later paleoanthropologists. They were not doing it with any knowledge of the future in which their mark would be found and dated and debated. They were doing it because something in them, whatever form the impulse took in a Neanderthal mind, required it. Required the act of saying, in the oldest language, in the language that exists before language, I was here, all of them were here, all 9 species, and however many others the fossils have not yet revealed. They were here across an enormous span of time, across every landscape that hominins had found their way into, making the tools they knew how to make and burying the dead they had the capacity to mourn and painting, some of them, in the dark. We are the last ones. That is a fact that deserves to sit with you for a moment in the dark before sleep comes. We are the last ones, and we are all of them. This has been Midnight Chronicle. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are tonight.